Part 1. A quiet afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot of a small grocery store on the edge of Chicago. The air was cool for an early October day, and the occasional breeze carried the faint smell of fallen leaves. Cars came and went, their drivers hurrying to finish errands before the weekend slipped away. Inside the store, the hum of fluorescent lights blended with the soft chatter of shoppers moving through the aisles. It was just another ordinary Saturday afternoon. Mia Johnson pushed her shopping cart slowly down the cereal aisle, scanning the shelves while keeping one eye on her 5-year-old son, Jamal. He stood next to her, clutching a box of brightly colored cereal like it was a treasure he didn't want to let go of. His round face lit up as he pointed to another box higher up on the shelf. "Mommy, can we get that one too?" he asked, his voice sweet and hopeful. Mia smiled warmly at him, though her mind was elsewhere. She had spent most of the morning cleaning the tiny apartment they shared, making sure everything was tidy before heading out to buy groceries. Money was tight, and she always tried to stretch what little she had as far as possible. Still, she couldn't resist indulging Jamal every now and then. "We'll see," she said gently, placing the first box into the cart. "But only if you promise to eat all your vegetables tonight." Jamal nodded eagerly, his curly hair bouncing with the motion. Satisfied, Mia turned back to the shelves, carefully comparing prices on different brands. Every choice mattered when you were living, paycheck to paycheck. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to check the time. Almost 4 o'clock. If she hurried, she could make it home in time to start dinner before her older daughter Tasha got back from soccer practice. As Mia moved toward the dairy section, she noticed a group of 3 men standing near the produce display. They were loud, laughing raucously about something none of the other shoppers seemed to understand. One of them, a wiry man with unkempt hair and a scruffy beard, was holding a bag of oranges, tossing it casually into the air and catching it again. Another, taller and broader, leaned against the shelf, drinking from a bottle hidden inside a brown paper bag. The third, shorter but wiry, paced back and forth, occasionally bumping into people without apologizing. Mia instinctively slowed her pace, steering her cart closer to the wall. She didn't want any trouble, especially not today. Her life was already stressful enough without adding unnecessary drama. But even as she tried to stay invisible, part of her couldn't help but glance over at the men. There was something unsettling about them, something that made her stomach tighten ever so slightly. "Mommy, why are those guys so loud?" Jamal whispered, tugging on her sleeve. "They're just having fun, sweetheart," Mia replied softly, trying to sound reassuring. "Let's focus on our shopping, okay?" Jamal nodded, though his wide eyes stayed fixed on the trio. They weren't paying attention to anyone around them, or maybe they were doing it on purpose. Either way, their behavior was starting to draw stares from other customers. An older woman clutching a basket of fresh vegetables shook her head disapprovingly as she passed by. A young couple exchanged nervous glances before quickly moving to the opposite side of the store. Mia did her best to ignore them, focusing instead on picking out a gallon of milk and some yogurt for breakfast. But the tension in the air was palpable, creeping into every corner of the store. Even the cashiers behind the checkout counters seemed distracted, glancing nervously toward the commotion whenever they thought no one was looking. At the far end of the store, Chris Carter stood in front of the frozen food section, staring absent-mindedly at a row of frozen pizzas. He wasn't really interested in buying anything. He'd stopped by the store after work to grab a few things for dinner and had gotten sidetracked by the noise coming from the other side of the building. At first he thought it might be kids fooling around, but when he glanced over, he saw the same group of men Mia had noticed earlier. Chris frowned, crossing his arms over his broad chest. He didn't know these guys personally, but he recognized the type. Loud, obnoxious, and drunk, or close enough to it that it didn't matter. He'd seen plenty of men like them during his years working as a mechanic at the local garage. They strutted around acting tough, picking fights over nothing, and generally making life miserable for everyone else. Chris hated bullies, plain and simple. His gaze shifted briefly to the rest of the store, taking in the reactions of the other shoppers. Most people avoided looking directly at the men, pretending to be absorbed in their own tasks. A few brave souls shot dirty looks in their direction, but no one dared say anything. Chris understood why. They didn't want to risk getting involved. Confrontations like this rarely ended well, and nobody wanted to be caught in the crossfire. Still, something about the situation gnawed at him. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was a vibe in the air that felt off, like the calm before a storm. And sure enough, moments later, the storm arrived. The wiry man with the scruffy beard, who would later introduce himself as Kyle, bumped hard into another shopper, sending a display of apples tumbling to the floor. The man stumbled backward, muttering an apology under his breath, but Kyle didn't even acknowledge him. Instead, he laughed loudly, slapping his friend on the shoulder as if it were the funniest thing in the world. Chris watched silently, his jaw tightening. He didn't like where this was headed. Out of the corner of his eye, he spotted Mia and her son near the dairy section. They hadn't moved much since he'd last seen them, probably because they were trying to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Smart move, he thought. But smart moves didn't always protect you from trouble. Kyle's laughter grew louder, echoing off the walls of the store. Several shoppers winced visibly, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to speak up. Then, without warning, Kyle turned his attention to Mia. She must have felt his eyes on her because she froze mid-step, her hand hovering uncertainly over a carton of eggs. "Hey, lady," Kyle called out, his voice cutting through the background, noise like a knife. "You gonna stand there all day or actually buy something?" Mia stiffened, her grip tightening on the handle of her cart. For a moment she considered ignoring him, pretending she hadn't heard. But deep down she knew that wouldn't work. Ignoring someone like Kyle only made them angrier. So instead, she forced herself to turn around and face him, her expression calm despite the knot forming in her stomach. "I'm just shopping," she said evenly, her voice steady. "Is there a problem?" Kyle smirked, clearly enjoying the attention. "No problem here," he replied, taking a step closer. "Just wondering why you're hogging the whole aisle. Some of us actually need to get stuff done." Behind him, his friend snickered, egging him on. Chris clenched his fists, feeling the familiar rush of anger bubbling beneath the surface. He'd dealt with jerks like Kyle before, both at work and in his personal life, and he knew exactly how this kind of game worked. Guys like Kyle fed off fear and intimidation, using their words and sometimes their fists to assert dominance over others. But this wasn't just some random argument between strangers. This was a grown man picking on a single mother in front of her child. That changed everything. Chris took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He wasn't the kind of guy who went looking for fights, but he also wasn't the kind of guy who stood by and let innocent people get bullied. Not when he had the chance to do something about it. As Kyle continued mocking Mia, Chris began walking toward them, his footsteps deliberate and measured. He didn't say anything at first, letting his presence speak for itself. When he finally reached the group, he planted himself firmly between Mia and Kyle, his towering frame casting a shadow over the smaller man. For a moment, no one spoke. The entire store seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, in a voice low and steady, Chris broke the silence. "Back off," he said simply, meeting Kyle's gaze without flinching. And just like that, the quiet afternoon at the grocery store became anything but ordinary. "Force-me too." The provocation. Kyle blinked, momentarily caught off guard by Chris's sudden appearance. For a second, it looked like he might actually back down, but then his lips curled into a sneer, and his eyes narrowed as he sized up the man, standing in front of him. Chris was tall, broad-shouldered, and clearly not someone to mess with lightly. Still, Kyle wasn't the type to let himself be intimidated, not even by someone who looked like they could bench press a car. "What's your deal, big guy?" Kyle asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You her bodyguard or something?" Chris didn't respond right away. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. He wasn't here to trade insults or play games. His only goal was to make sure Mia and Jamal were safe, and if that meant putting himself between them and this loudmouth, so be it. Mia, meanwhile, tried to shrink into the background. She kept one hand on Jamal's shoulder, pulling him close, as if to shield him from what might happen next. Her heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm for her son's sake. "It's okay," she whispered softly to Jamal, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed it herself. The other shoppers in the store seemed frozen in place, their eyes darting nervously between Chris and Kyle. Some had already started, inching toward the exits, ready to leave at the first sign of real trouble. Others stayed rooted where they were, too curious or too scared to move. Kyle's friends, sensing the tension rising, began egging him on. "Come on, man," said the taller one, laughing nervously. "Don't let some musclehead ruin our fun." "Yeah," chimed in the shorter one, taking a swig from his hidden bottle. "Show him who's boss." Kyle grinned, emboldened by their support. He stepped closer to Chris, trying to appear braver than he felt. "Listen, pal," he said, jabbing a finger toward Chris's chest. "I don't know who you think you are, but you better step aside before things get ugly." Chris didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his voice low and calm. "Things are already ugly," he replied. "And if you're looking for trouble, you've come to the wrong place." For a moment, Kyle faltered. There was something about Chris's demeanor, his quiet confidence, his refusal to rise to the bait, that threw him off balance. But pride, and maybe a little too much alcohol, kept him from backing down. Instead, he doubled down, raising his voice so everyone in the store could hear him. "Oh, I'm shaking in my boots," Kyle mocked, throwing his hands up dramatically. "What are you gonna do, tough guy? Beat me up over a couple of apples?" Chris didn't respond immediately. He glanced briefly at Mia and Jamal, noting the fear in their eyes. Then he turned his attention back to Kyle, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. "No," he said finally, his voice firm. "But I will stop you from harassing people who haven't done anything wrong." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Several shoppers nodded in agreement, their earlier hesitation giving way to quiet approval. Even Kyle's friends exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether they should keep encouraging him or try to defuse the situation. Kyle, however, was beyond reason now. The combination of booze, bravado, and embarrassment pushed him over the edge. "Harassing people?" he spat, his face reddening. "Lady, you hear this guy? Thinks he's some kind of hero just because he showed up late to the party." Mia opened her mouth to say something, anything, but Chris raised a hand subtly, signaling her to stay quiet. She obeyed, biting her lip as she watched the confrontation unfold. "You want to act tough?" Chris said, addressing Kyle directly. "Fine, go ahead. But pick on someone your own size, or better yet, don't pick on anyone at all." The line drew a few chuckles from nearby shoppers, which only made Kyle angrier. He clenched his fists, his whole body tensing as he prepared to lash out. For a split second, it looked like he might actually throw a punch. But before he could make a move, one of his friends grabbed his arm, holding him back. "Dude, chill," the friend muttered under his breath. "Not worth it." Kyle shook him off angrily, glaring at Chris with pure hatred. "You think you're so smart, huh?" he growled. "Well, enjoy playing babysitter. See how far that gets you." With that, he turned on his heel and stormed off, his friends trailing behind him like loyal dogs. The trio disappeared into the produce section, muttering curses and threats under their breath. But despite their bluster, it was clear they weren't sticking around to cause any more trouble, not with Chris watching them like a hawk. As the tension eased, the store gradually returned to normal. Shoppers resumed their activities, though. Many lingered near the checkout counters, eager to share their thoughts about what had just happened. Whispers filled the air, mingling with the hum of refrigerators and the beep of scanners. Chris exhaled slowly, feeling the adrenaline drain from his system. He hadn't planned on getting involved, but sometimes doing the right thing meant stepping up when no one else would. Turning to Mia, he offered her a small, reassuring smile. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft now. Mia nodded, though. Her hands were still trembling slightly. "Yes? Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Chris shrugged modestly, brushing off her gratitude. Just doing what anyone else would have done, he said, though deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Most people wouldn't have intervened, especially not against someone as unpredictable as Kyle. But Chris had never been one to stand idly by while others suffered. Jamal tugged on his mother's sleeve, looking up at Chris with wide, awestruck eyes. "That was awesome," he exclaimed, breaking the somber mood. "You totally told those guys off?" Chris chuckled, kneeling down so he was eye level with the boy. "Well, I'm glad you thought so," he said with a wink. "But remember, it's always better to walk away from fights if you can. Violence doesn't solve anything." Jamal nodded solemnly, as if committing Chris's words to memory. Mia smiled faintly, grateful for the lesson. In a world where kindness often felt scarce, moments like these reminded her that there were still good people out there. People willing to stand up for strangers simply because it was the right thing to do. As Chris stood back up, an elderly woman approached them, leaning heavily on her cane. Her gray hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her sharp blue eyes sparkled with determination. "Excuse me," she said, her voice strong and clear despite her age. "I just wanted to say thank you. It's refreshing to see someone take a stand like that." Chris scratched the back of his neck awkwardly, unused to receiving praise. "It was nothing, ma'am," he replied. "Really?" The woman waved a dismissive hand. "Nonsense," she said firmly. "What you did took courage, and we need more of that in this world. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Her words struck a chord with Chris, reminding him why he'd stepped in to begin with. It wasn't about being a hero or earning recognition. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Sometimes that meant facing down bullies in a grocery store. Other times it meant lending a helping hand to a neighbor or speaking up when injustice reared its ugly head. Mia watched the exchange silently, her heart swelling with gratitude. She wished she could express how much Chris's actions meant to her, but words felt inadequate. Instead, she extended her hand, offering a handshake. "Thank you again," she said sincerely. "I won't forget this." Chris accepted the handshake, his grip firm but gentle. "Take care of yourself," he said, nodding toward Jamal. "And don't let anyone push you around, all right?" "I'll try," Mia replied, managing a small laugh despite everything. With that, she pushed her cart toward the checkout line, eager to finish her shopping and head home. Chris lingered for a moment longer, watching as Mia and Jamal disappeared into the crowd. He felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, satisfaction, and a lingering unease. While he was glad the situation had resolved peacefully, he couldn't shake the feeling that Kyle and his friends might cause trouble elsewhere. Bullies rarely changed their ways overnight. Shaking his head, Chris decided to focus on the positives. Today he'd made a difference, however small, and sometimes that was enough. He grabbed a loaf of bread from the bakery section and headed toward the register, ready to put the incident behind him for now. Part 4. Unexpected Allies. The parking lot was quiet, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the asphalt. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and damp leaves, a reminder of the season's shift. Chris stood near Mia's car, watching as she buckled Jamal into the back seat. Despite the tension that had just unfolded, there was a sense of calm now, a fragile peace that seemed to settle over the scene. "You sure you're good from here?" Chris asked one last time, his tone casual but laced with concern. Mia nodded, forcing a smile. "Yes, we're fine now. Thank you again for everything." Chris gave her a small nod, his expression softening. "No problem. Just keep your head up, all right? People like them aren't worth your energy." His words carried weight, and Mia felt a flicker of strength ignite within her. She closed the car door gently, then turned to face him fully. For a moment she wanted to say more, to tell him how much his presence had meant in a moment when she'd felt so powerless, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she simply said, "You're a good man, Chris, don't forget that." Chris chuckled softly, scratching the back of his neck awkwardly. He wasn't used to being called a hero or receiving praise, especially not from someone he barely knew. "I'm just doing what anyone else would have done," he replied, though deep down he knew that wasn't entirely true. As Mia climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, Chris stepped back, giving her space to pull out of the parking spot. He watched her car drive away, its taillights glowing red against the dimming light of the day. Only when it disappeared around the corner did he finally turn toward his own truck, parked a few rows over. But before he could take more than a few steps, a voice called out behind him. "Excuse me, sir." Chris stopped and turned, surprised to see Margaret, the elderly woman who had confronted Kyle, hurrying toward him. Her cane clicked rhythmically against the pavement, and despite her age, she moved with surprising speed. Behind her trailed Alex, the young cashier, clutching his phone tightly in one hand. "Wait up," Margaret said, panting slightly as she reached him. "We wanted to thank you properly." Chris frowned, unsure why they were going out of their way to talk to him. "It's really not necessary," he said, shifting his grocery bag to his other hand. "I didn't do anything special." Margaret raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by his modesty. "Nonsense," she declared firmly. "What you did today took guts, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise, including yourself." Alex nodded in agreement, speaking up for the first time. "Yeah, seriously. That guy was scary, but you handled it like a pro. I called the police while you were helping that lady with her groceries. They should be here soon." Chris blinked, caught off guard by the news. "You called the cops?" he asked, glancing back toward the store. "That's smart thinking." "Well, someone had to," Alex admitted sheepishly. "I figured if those guys stuck around, things might get worse. And honestly, I didn't want anyone else getting hurt." Margaret patted Alex on the shoulder, approvingly. "Good instincts, kid. We can't rely on everyone to step up like our friend here." She gestured toward Chris with a proud smile. "But teamwork makes all the difference." Chris felt a surge of gratitude toward these strangers who had gone out of their way to support him, and Mia. It wasn't often he encountered people willing to stand up for what was right, especially in situations where personal risk was involved. Yet here they were, an elderly woman with a sharp tongue, a shy cashier barely out of his teens, and himself, a mechanic who just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Before Chris could respond, the distant wail of sirens cut through the quiet evening. A police cruiser pulled into the parking lot, its flashing lights reflecting off the rows of cars. Two officers stepped out, their expressions serious as they approached the group. "What's going on here?" one of them asked, his gaze sweeping over Chris, Margaret, and Alex. Margaret stepped forward without hesitation, her demeanor confident despite her age. "Those three men inside the store were causing trouble earlier," she explained, pointing toward the entrance. "They harassed a young mother and her child, and this gentleman," she gestured toward Chris, "intervened to protect them. We thought it best to report it before they caused any more harm." The officer nodded, jotting down notes in his pad. "Do you know their names?" he asked. "No, but they're still inside," Margaret replied. "Or at least they were when we came out here." The second officer radioed for backup before heading into the store to investigate. Meanwhile, the first officer turned his attention to Chris. "Can you tell me what happened?" Chris hesitated, unsure how much detail to share. He didn't want to come across as boastful or overly dramatic. "It wasn't anything major," he began cautiously. "One of them bumped into a shopper and knocked over some apples. Then he started hassling a woman and her son. I stepped in to make sure they left them alone." "And did they threaten you?" the officer pressed. Chris shook his head. "Not exactly. They were mostly just loud and obnoxious. But I didn't want them escalating things, so I stayed close until the woman and her kid got to their car safely." The officer studied him for a moment, clearly impressed by his calm demeanor. "Well, thanks for stepping up," he said finally. "A lot of people wouldn't have gotten involved." "It's no big deal," Chris muttered, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just trying to help." While the officers continued questioning Margaret and Alex, Chris noticed a growing crowd gathering near the store's entrance. Some shoppers lingered curiously, eager to see how the situation would resolve. Others offered nods of approval as they passed by, silently acknowledging Chris's role in diffusing the conflict. One man in particular caught Chris's attention. Greg, a middle-aged customer with salt and pepper hair and a warm smile, approached him with an outstretched hand. "Hey, I just wanted to say thanks," he said sincerely. "My wife and I saw what happened back there. You handled it perfectly." Chris shook his hand, feeling a mix of pride and humility. "Appreciate it," he replied, "but I couldn't have done it without these folks pitching in." He gestured toward Margaret and Alex, who were still talking to the officers. Greg followed his gaze and nodded. "True. Still, it takes someone special to put themselves in the line of fire like that. Not everyone has the guts." Chris shrugged, unsure how to respond. He hadn't thought of himself as particularly brave. He'd simply reacted to a situation that needed addressing. But hearing others describe him that way made him pause. Maybe he had underestimated the impact of his actions, not just on Mia and Jamal, but on everyone who had witnessed the confrontation. By the time the officers returned from inside the store, they had detained Kyle and his friends, who were now sitting on a bench near the entrance, looking sullen and defeated. The taller of the two officers addressed the group. "We've got statements from several witnesses, including the woman who was targeted. These guys are going to have a chat with us downtown. Hopefully this teaches them a lesson about picking on innocent people." Margaret crossed her arms, clearly satisfied with the outcome. "Good," she said firmly. "Maybe next time they'll think twice before acting like fools." The officers thanked everyone for their cooperation before escorting Kyle and his friends to the patrol car. As the sirens faded into the distance, the tension in the parking lot lifted completely. Shoppers began dispersing, returning to their cars or heading back inside to finish their errands. Chris lingered for a moment longer, exchanging a few final words with Margaret and Alex. "You guys take care, all right?" he said, offering each of them a grateful smile. "And thanks for having my back," Margaret waved dismissively. "Don't mention it. Just promise me you'll keep being the kind of person who stands up for others." "I'll try," Chris replied, chuckling softly. With that, he headed toward his truck, sliding into the driver's seat and letting out a long breath. The events of the day replayed in his mind. The confrontation, the teamwork, the resolution. It had been a whirlwind, but somehow it felt worth it. As he drove home, Chris reflected on the power of community. Alone, he might have managed to protect Mia and Jamal, but together, he and the others had sent a message. Bullying and harassment wouldn't be tolerated. Not here, not anywhere. And though he doubted he'd ever see any of them again, he knew their shared experience had forged a bond, one built on courage, kindness, and the simple act of standing up for what was right. Back at her apartment, Mia tucked Jamal into bed, his eyes heavy with sleep after the long day. She sat beside him for a moment, brushing his hair back tenderly. "Mommy, is that man coming back tomorrow?" he asked groggily, referring to Chris. Mia smiled, touched by her son's admiration for the stranger who had helped them. "Probably not, sweetheart," she replied softly. "But we'll always remember what he did for us, won't we?" Jamal nodded, yawning deeply. "He's a superhero." Mia laughed quietly, kissing his forehead. "In a way, yes, he is." She turned off the bedside lamp and closed her son's bedroom door gently behind her. As she moved to the living room, she found herself thinking about Chris, and Margaret, Alex, and even Greg. Ordinary people who had chosen to stand up when it mattered most. Their actions reminded her that while the world could sometimes feel cruel and unfair, there was still goodness to be found in unexpected places, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep her going. Part 3. Standing Ground. Chris stood at the checkout counter, placing his loaf of bread and a carton of orange juice onto the conveyor belt. The cashier, a young man named Alex with dark-rimmed glasses and a shy demeanor, glanced up briefly, before scanning the items. His hands moved quickly, but his eyes kept darting toward the produce section where Kyle and his friends had disappeared. It was clear that the earlier confrontation was still on everyone's mind. "Rough day, huh?" Alex said quietly, attempting to lighten the mood as he bagged Chris's groceries. Chris shrugged, offering a faint smile. Could have been worse, he replied. At least no one got hurt. Alex nodded, though his expression remained uneasy. He glanced over his shoulder again, clearly worried that Kyle and his crew might return. Chris noticed the tension in the young man's posture and decided not to linger too long. After paying for his items, he picked up his bag and turned to leave. But something stopped him. Out of the corner of his eye, he spotted Kyle pacing near the store's exit, talking animatedly with his two friends. They weren't leaving after all. In fact, they seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. Chris frowned, his instincts telling him this wasn't over yet. He hesitated for a moment, debating whether to confront them again or simply walk away. But then he saw Mia approaching the checkout line with Jamal by her side. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped slightly under the weight of the afternoon's events. Jamal, on the other hand, clung tightly to her hand, his wide eyes scanning the room cautiously. Chris sighed inwardly. As much as he wanted to avoid further conflict, he couldn't just stand by and let Mia face those guys alone, not when she'd already been through so much today. Without another thought, he set his grocery bag down on a nearby shelf and walked back toward the registers. Mia barely noticed him at first. She was focused on loading her items onto the conveyor belt, her movements deliberate and careful. Every now and then she glanced nervously toward the exit, clearly aware of Kyle's presence. When Chris stepped beside her, she jumped slightly, startled by his sudden appearance. "Hey," he said gently, giving her a reassuring smile. "Mind if I stick around until you're done? Just in case." Mia blinked, taken aback by his kindness. "You don't have to do that," she protested weakly, though relief flickered across her face. "I'll be fine." "I know you will," Chris replied firmly. "But why take chances? Besides, it's no trouble." Jamal looked up at Chris with admiration, clearly thrilled to have such an imposing figure on their side. "Yeah, Mommy," he chimed in eagerly. "He can protect us." Mia couldn't help but laugh softly, shaking her head. All right, she conceded. "Thank you." The three of them waited together as the cashier rang up Mia's purchases. Chris kept a watchful eye on Kyle and his friends, who were now leaning against the wall near the automatic doors. They hadn't made any aggressive moves yet, but their body language suggested they weren't planning to leave anytime soon. Every few seconds, Kyle would glance over at Mia, his lips curling into a sneer. When the transaction was complete, Chris offered to carry Mia's heavier bags to her car. She hesitated briefly before nodding, grateful for the help. Together, the group made their way toward the exit, Chris positioning himself between Mia and the trio of men. As they approached, Kyle pushed off the wall, blocking their path. His two friends flanked him, forming a loose semicircle that forced Mia and Chris to stop. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Well, Kyle drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "Looks like Mr. Hero here isn't done playing knight in shining armor." Chris didn't respond immediately. Instead, he shifted his stance slightly, ensuring he was fully between Mia and Kyle. His expression remained calm, almost bored, as if he'd dealt with situations like this 100 times before. "Step aside," he said evenly. "You've caused enough trouble for one day." Kyle laughed, though there was no humor in the sound. "Or what?" he challenged, taking a step closer. "You gonna call the cops? Oh wait, what are they gonna do? Arrest me for breathing?" Chris didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he locked eyes with Kyle, his gaze steady and unflinching. "I'm not here to threaten you," he said calmly. "I'm here to make sure these folks get to their car safely. So unless you want to escalate this further, I suggest you move." For a moment, Kyle faltered. There was something about Chris's tone, calm but commanding, that made him hesitate. But pride, and perhaps the lingering effects of alcohol, kept him from backing down. "You think you scare me?" he spat, jabbing a finger toward Chris's chest. "Big guy like you picking fights with little old me? Real fair, huh?" Chris didn't budge. He simply raised an eyebrow, his patience wearing thin. "This isn't a fight," he said, his voice low and firm. "It's me asking nicely, for now. Don't make me regret being polite." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Several shoppers who had gathered nearby exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. Even Kyle's friends seemed uneasy, shifting their weight from foot to foot as they watched the standoff unfold. Kyle clenched his fists, his face reddening with anger. For a split second, it looked like he might actually throw a punch. But before he could act, Margaret, the elderly woman with the sharp tongue and no-nonsense attitude, stepped forward, her cane clicking loudly against the tiled floor. "That's quite enough nonsense from you boys," she declared, her voice strong and authoritative. "If you've got nothing better to do than harass decent folks, maybe it's time you left." Kyle turned to glare at her, clearly annoyed by the interruption.
"Stay out of this, Grandma," he snapped. "This doesn't concern you."
Margaret raised an eyebrow, unimpressed by his attempted intimidation. "Oh, but it does," she replied coolly. "Because if you don't leave right now, I'll personally see to it that management bans you from this store forever. And trust me, I know the owner." Her words caught Kyle off guard. He opened his mouth to argue but quickly closed it again, realizing he was outnumbered. His friends exchanged uneasy glances, silently urging him to drop the issue. Grumbling under his breath, Kyle finally stepped aside, allowing Mia, Chris, and Jamal to pass. As they walked toward the parking lot, Chris glanced back briefly, ensuring Kyle and his crew weren't following them. Once he was satisfied they were safe, he turned his attention back to Mia. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Mia nodded, though her hands were still trembling slightly. "Yes. Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to repay you for this." Chris shook his head, dismissing her gratitude. "No need," he said simply. "Just promise me you'll stay safe, all right?" "I will," Mia replied, managing a small smile despite everything. With that, she unlocked her car and began loading her groceries into the trunk. Chris helped her finish, handing Jamal the last bag before stepping back. "Well," Chris said, offering a final wave, "take care of yourself and your kids. You're stronger than you think." Mia watched as he walked away, her heart swelling with gratitude. She wished she could express how much his actions meant to her, but words felt inadequate. Instead, she climbed into the driver's seat, buckling Jamal into his car seat before starting the engine. As she drove home, she replayed the events of the afternoon in her mind. While she wished she hadn't needed rescuing in the first place, she couldn't deny the impact Chris's courage had made, not just on her, but on everyone who had witnessed the confrontation. Sometimes, it took just one person standing up to remind others that kindness and bravery still existed in the world, and for Mia, that reminder came at exactly the right time. Part 5. Aftermath and Reflection. The evening air was cool as Chris pulled into the driveway of his modest home. The neighborhood was quiet, with only the occasional chirp of crickets breaking the silence. He turned off the engine and sat in his truck for a moment, staring at the steering wheel without really seeing it. His mind replayed the events of the day like a movie stuck on repeat. The loud voices, the tension in the grocery store, the way Mia had looked so scared yet determined to protect her son. Chris sighed deeply, running a hand over his face. Wasn't used to feeling this drained after work, but today had been different. It wasn't just about stopping Kyle or helping Mia. It was about realizing how fragile peace could be and how quickly things could spiral out of control. For a brief moment, he wondered if he'd done enough or too much. But then he shook his head, dismissing the thought. There was no point, second-guessing himself now. What mattered was that Mia and Jamal were safe, and Kyle wouldn't be bothering anyone else anytime soon. Inside the house, Chris kicked off his boots and tossed his keys onto the kitchen counter. The familiar creak of the floorboards beneath his feet brought a sense of comfort, grounding him in the present. He opened the refrigerator, grabbed a bottle of water, and leaned against the doorway, sipping slowly as he let his thoughts wander. He thought about Margaret first, the elderly woman who had stepped forward with such authority and confidence. Her words had carried weight, not because she shouted or demanded attention, but because she spoke with conviction. Chris admired that kind of courage, the kind that came from years of experience and wisdom. Then there was Alex, the young cashier, whose hands had trembled as he dialed the police. Despite his fear, he hadn't hesitated to act, proving that bravery didn't always look like charging into battle. It sometimes meant making the right call when it mattered most. Even Greg, the stranger who had offered a simple handshake and a few words of gratitude, had left an impression on Chris. It reminded him that even small gestures of support could make a big difference. Together, they had formed an unlikely alliance, united by a shared desire to protect others from harm. Night fell. Chris wandered into his garage, flipping on the overhead light. The space smelled faintly of oil and sawdust, a testament to the countless hours he spent tinkering with engines or working on personal projects. He settled onto a stool, resting his elbows on the cluttered workbench. His gaze drifted to a framed photo hanging on the wall, a picture of him and his late father standing beside an old pickup truck they had restored together years ago. His dad had taught him many things, but one lesson stood out above the rest. When you see someone struggling, don't wait for someone else to step up. Be the person who makes a difference. Chris had taken those words to heart, though he rarely talked about them. They weren't flashy or dramatic. They were simple, truths etched into his character. Tonight, however, those words felt especially relevant. He realized that what happened at the grocery store wasn't just about standing up to bullies. It was about creating ripples of kindness and justice in a world that often seemed chaotic and unfair. Maybe Mia and Jamal would remember him fondly. Maybe they wouldn't, but either way, his actions had planted a seed. And perhaps that seed would grow into something meaningful, not just for them, but for others who witnessed the confrontation. Meanwhile, across town, Mia sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea cradled between her hands. The apartment was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. Tasha, her teenage daughter, was in her room doing homework, while Jamal slept soundly down the hall. For once, everything felt calm and safe. Mia stared into her tea, watching the steam curl upward in delicate wisps. She couldn't stop thinking about Chris and how he had intervened when she needed it most. She wished she could thank him again, properly this time, but she knew she might never see him again. Still, the memory of his steady voice and calm demeanor lingered, reminding her that good people existed, even in moments when it felt like the world was against her. Her thoughts shifted to Margaret, the elderly woman who had confronted Kyle without hesitation. There was something inspiring about her boldness, her refusal to back down despite her age. Mia found herself wondering what it must feel like to live life with such certainty, such unshakable confidence. Maybe someday she thought she could channel that same strength. She also remembered Alex, the young cashier whose quiet courage had ensured the authorities arrived in time. And Greg, the stranger who had offered a kind word when it mattered most. Each of them had played a role in turning a potentially dangerous situation into something manageable and hopeful. For Mia, the day served as a reminder that she wasn't alone. Yes, life was hard, and yes, raising 2 kids on her own came with challenges she couldn't always prepare for. But there were moments, like today, when strangers became allies, and ordinary people became heroes. Those moments gave her hope, fueling her determination to keep moving forward no matter what. The next morning, Chris woke early as he always did. He brewed a pot of coffee and stepped outside, breathing in the crisp autumn air. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. As he sipped his coffee, he noticed a note taped to his front door. Curious, he peeled it off and unfolded the paper. "Dear Chris," it read, "thank you for being brave when we needed it most. You reminded us all that kindness matters. From your neighbors." Chris smiled faintly, tucking the note into his pocket. He didn't know who had written it, or whether it was Margaret, Alex, or someone else entirely. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the message behind the words. Acts of courage, no matter how small, had the power to inspire others. Later that week, Mia returned to the grocery store, this time accompanied by Tasha. She approached the checkout counter where Alex worked, greeting him with a warm smile. "Hi," she said softly. "I wanted to thank you again for calling the police that day." I don't think I said it properly before. Alex blushed, clearly surprised by the acknowledgement. Oh, you're welcome, he stammered. It was nothing, really. It wasn't nothing, Mia replied firmly. You helped keep us safe, that means a lot. Alex nodded, looking both proud and embarrassed. Well, I'm glad I could help. As Mia pushed her cart toward the exit, she spotted Margaret browsing the produce section. The elderly woman waved cheerfully when she saw her, hobbling over with surprising speed. How are you holding up, dear? She asked, her sharp eyes scanning Mia's face. I'm doing okay, Mia admitted, managing a genuine smile. Thanks to you, and everyone else who stepped up. Margaret patted her arm affectionately. We take care of our own around here, she said simply. Don't ever forget that. Mia nodded, feeling a lump rise in her throat. She didn't trust herself to speak, so she simply hugged Margaret tightly before heading to her car. Weeks passed, and life returned to its usual rhythm. Chris continued fixing cars at the garage, occasionally sharing stories with coworkers about random acts of kindness he'd seen or experienced. Mia focused on her job and her kids, finding joy in the little victories. A perfect report card from Tasha, a drawing Jamal proudly presented at dinner, but neither of them forgot the day they crossed paths at the grocery store. For Chris, it reinforced his belief in the importance of standing up for others, even when it was inconvenient or uncomfortable. For Mia, it reminded her that strength came in many forms, and that sometimes all it took was one person to change the course of a day. And though their lives remained separate, they carried the memory of that afternoon with them. A quiet reminder that even in the most unexpected moments, courage could shine through and make the world a little brighter.